Thank you, listeners, for joining us today. On this Monday, it is September 15th. I'm in studio with Dr. Scott Gavorsky. Dr. Gavorsky's been on our program before. We appreciate his coming on the program today. He hosts a podcast. He's a co-host of 775 Alive, which is a Nevada politics podcast. He's a former professor at Great Basin College, and in his current capacity, we thought it would be really valuable to talk to him. He is chairman of the Elko County Republican Central Committee. Dr. Gavorsky, and we go way back. I'll call you Scott. That's okay?
That'll be perfectly fine. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, and thank you, Scott, for being on the program today. So I did reach out, and it was very short notice because it was today. Because I woke up like I'm thinking a lot of us woke up wondering, how do we get to the next best place? You know, as a country, as a community, how do we resolve some of these divisive issues? We did reach out to Lance Whitney, who chairs the Elko County Democratic Central Committee, but again, it was very last minute, so have not heard back from Lance. I'm sure he'll have a chance to chime in. And in fact, we're going to talk about a very special Thursday program, We the People, celebrating the Constitution, of which the community's invited. So Scott, first of all, you did not hesitate, which I appreciate, on today's topic. How do we tone down the rhetoric and respectfully start to disagree again over these divisive political issues? And sort of the personal theme I've adopted is, choose a different path.
Yeah, I think that's something we're going to have to be as a community and as a society looking towards a little bit more forcefully, if you excuse that term, going forward. We're going to have to get back to really talking about some of these issues. We've got a lot of changes going on, right? And change, again, as you mentioned, I'm a historian, so change is part of the natural order of things. And negotiating that change is always going to be difficult, right? And it's one of the things that we're going to have to choose to talk about these issues, because a lot of them are going to go deep into policies. My personal belief is we're seeing a lot of systems that were established in the 1930s and 1940s domestically and internationally that are starting to fall apart. They've ossified. And that's a particularly fraught moment of change because so much is changing so rapidly. But that doesn't mean that the traditional way we've approached these through discourse, through policy debates, have gone by the wayside, right? The rapidity of change, the volume of change doesn't justify throwing out how you deal with change.
Talking with Dr. Scott Gavorsky and here on Elko Live, and we're going to refer a lot to Utah Governor Spencer Cox, because he made the rounds of all the national talk shows on Sunday. It is his state where the assassination of Charlie Kirk happened just last Wednesday. But he is a governor who has been speaking for some time about restoring trust in institutions, seeing the humanity in our political or ideological opponents, and agreeing, some people say agree to disagree, but to disagree better is what he has been offering. And so I think, Scott, we'll play this clip. It's almost 3 minutes long, but I think it might help listeners understand where we're thinking of going with this conversation. Again, just trying to be helpful, creating more understanding, and then trying to be responsible and to guide people in the right direction. So this is Utah Governor Spencer Cox as he was speaking to Kristen Welker on NBC's Meet the Press.
We have frankly praised what we heard from you on Friday, your unifying message. You said you see this as a watershed moment. How can this nation step back from the brink, Governor?
So look, this is, you mentioned it in the introduction, but we have seen an escalation in violence that has been happening across the country. We've had periods like this in our past history. I've mentioned before in the late 60s and early 70s, certainly we saw these types of high profile political assassinations, another dark time in our history. People keep waiting for somebody to lead us out of this. And I think that's a mistake. I don't think any one person, certainly not a governor. I don't think a president. I don't think anyone can can change the trajectory of this. It truly is about every single one of us. And I can't emphasize enough the damage that social media and the internet is doing to all of us. Those dopamine hits, these companies, $1 trillion market caps, the most powerful companies in the history of the world, have figured out how to hack our brains, get us addicted to outrage, which is the same type of dopamine, the same chemical that you get from taking fentanyl, get us addicted to outrage and get us to hate each other. I'm seeing it in real time since the tragic death of Charlie Kirk. I'm seeing it in every corner of our society. The conflict entrepreneurs are taking advantage of us, and we are losing our agency, and we have to take that back. We have to turn it off. We have to get back to community, caring about our neighbors, the things that make American great, serving each other, bettering ourselves, exercising, sleeping, all of those things that this takes away from us.
Well, Governor, you referred to social media as a cancer on Friday. That's an incredibly strong word. Do you believe that social media played a direct role in this assassination?
I believe that social media has played a direct role in every single assassination and assassination attempt that we have seen over the last 5-6 years. There is no question in my mind that cancer probably isn't a strong enough word. What we have done, especially to our kids, it took us a decade to realize how evil these algorithms are, and we're doing everything in Utah, first state in the nation a couple years ago to pass comprehensive reform. Sadly, these most powerful companies on earth are suing us to prevent us from implementing these things.
So that is the clip that we wanted to isolate. So Scott, is he brave? I mean, Utah's Governor Spencer Cox is conservative. He has come up against President Trump at times, and although I think this latest is more of a back and forth, he's calling for peace at a time when it seems as though the president and the current administration is calling for more fear, if not violence.
Well, I'm not sure I'd agree necessarily with that case, but on the question of Spencer Cox, I think he's absolutely right. He's been very impressive throughout this whole tragic situation, and I agree a lot of stuff with what he said on the social media side. I think one of the problems that's key, and part of where I disagree with the categorization you just made, is that there is a tendency in times like these to look for sort of governmental solutions. Right now, he talked about not finding it in some hero that's going to come out and calm everything down. But it also gets into, I think, a whole range of issues. You also have to be careful not going too far the other way, where government's trying to regulate political rhetoric in the thing they're doing, or in the thought that they're doing good, that they're calming the situation. But in many cases, what they're doing is just increasing frustration, increasing tension. It's also interesting that he used the term cancer, which Kristen Welker called him out for, because the other thing that's starting to show up in a lot of the literature out of this is the idea of metastasization, that the political rhetoric has gotten so out of hand, in the medical sense, metastasizing is spreading to other parts of the body, that other issues are now being seen only through that political lens. So it becomes more and more impossible, I think, for us to have discussions about policies where we really should be united, because we're only seeing it through the lens that somebody who doesn't agree with me 100% must therefore be the enemy.
And two really good points on that, too. I'm going to make a note about the algorithms, because a friend and I had a very good, we call it a discussion, but we were texting back and forth last week when I noted how distressed she was. But I do want to revisit, Scott, this idea that maybe you don't agree that the president might be encouraging violence, or because he is calling out the left, and he is suggesting, and he is using very strong language and name calling, in fact. And so that doesn't bring people together. That divides people when you start pointing that out.
No, and I'd bring out that there's been a lot of it on the other side as well, right? Going back to, the corn pop, let me drag you behind the
See,
barn.
I've never even heard of that. I don't know what you're talking about.
That was a large part of Biden's rhetoric during the 2020 campaign. But we've seen a lot of this rhetoric about, you've got to fight, we're going to punch him in the face, we're going to knock him down. So I think there is something where both sides are problematic in this thing. But again, there is also sort of a real question that I don't think we're quite at the stage of being able to address, is we've sort of blurred the lines between speech and action and violence, right? So a lot of the talk that speech is violence leads to an idea that speech is violence, therefore speech is an action, therefore that's actionable violence that can be addressed through these other techniques. And that's very problematic as well. That probably needs to be looked at much more closely on these as part of this rhetoric.
So are you suggesting it's okay to use threatening speech or language that, because I want to understand.
Yeah, no, not at all. I'm not saying that at all. But speech qua speech is not the same as actions. And I think that's where we've gotten sort of off track, is that by the use of certain words, that justifies a de facto action, which under the law, under a lot of ideas of morality, a lot of civic standards, becomes something which one can at least address equally. And I think that's part of the issue we're going to have to look much more closely. It's far beyond calling people names, right? But it is the type of stuff that I think is making this issue far, far more difficult to address. If we say, okay, well, we're for free speech unless you talk about or one of these things, then we can either act directly or, again, more disturbingly, invoke government action against you for doing this. Right.
Well, and that leads us to another really good quote that I pulled from Governor Cox and what he's been saying, and this is just directly quoting him. Political violence is different than any other type of violence for lots of different reasons. As he continued, one, because in the very act that Charlie, speaking of Charlie Kirk, championed of expression, that freedom of expression that is enshrined in our founding documents, in having his life taken in that very act, makes it more difficult for people to feel like they can share their ideas, that they can speak freely. I mean, I take that to mean, Scott, that Charlie Kirk's freedom of speech and expression is just as valuable, but no more valuable than yours or mine.
Oh, no, I agree with that 100%. I think Governor Cox is absolutely correct in that. And that's one of the issues we've I think, moved away from a bit, is recognizing that true freedom of speech is going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people a lot of the time, right? But the solution to more, or the solution to speech we disagree with is more speech, right? And I think that's something that we probably need to get back to.
And obviously, it's what we do here on Elko Live every day. Generally, we're focusing on, we don't get into really hyper political conversations, Scott, and I think I don't have an appetite to do that personally, but I thought that it would be valuable to have a conversation, not so much about our differences, but about, I don't mean you and me personally, we don't really have differences. We have a lot of things in common, but what our community has in common, for example, because in listening to people like Governor Cox, again, who he's in this position of this assassination has happened in his state. He is a governor who is known for pushing back against a more extreme form of Republican leadership. I don't know that I would ever call Governor Cox a moderate, but he's calling this a watershed in American history. As you heard the quote, it could spell either the end of a chapter of violence, which this is what I hope our conversation is lending toward, or the beginning of a much more violent chapter in American history.
Yeah, and that's, of course, that's the question. I tend to be, and again, coming back from the historian perspective, and Governor Cox mentioned this, we have seen periods of violence like this before, unfortunately, and it's one thing that we've worked through, and a lot of that working through has really been, and this is a true compliment to the American system as a whole, has been because we've been able to keep those fundamental channels of communication open, either through the recognition of rights, through a continuing functioning of government. Again, one of the things that we hold strongly is that one of the things the Constitution does is actually provide a mechanism to work through these differences. Now, it can be slow, frustratingly slow at times, but that's going to be one of the things I think that's going to have to be key to get us through this is a return to fundamentals and not seeing the debates of today as somehow so unique that they require jettisoning what's worked for now, 238 years.
Mm-hmm. Scott Gavorsky is our guest today. He chairs the Elko County Republican Central Committee. Again, getting back to, as I had mentioned, having this great text exchange with a friend. I knew she was distressed, and I reached out to her. And what we determined, Scott, just in short, is that we literally were not seeing the same things. We are both fairly active on our social media. Her algorithm was giving her some information. My algorithm was giving me some that was obviously different than hers. We were able to come to a great understanding of that and a conversation. But this is what's happening. This is where this social media cancer, I think, comes in that Governor Cox referred to.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a huge part of the issue. So it's not only the algorithms that are serving to isolate us in the sense of not giving us information. For a lot of my projects, when I'm doing research, it's getting harder and harder to do direct research off the internet just because the algorithms are sort of misreading what I'm trying to find, right? So I'm finding myself more and more having to go back to sort of older traditional techniques, finding old articles and going back through their bibliographies. But this dopamine thing is really interesting, and if I can, just a slight digression, my podcast co-host Crystal Newton and I have talked about this a lot because, like it or not, those dopamine hits are vital for advertising and marketing right now. So talking about that in terms of, how do you build an audience for a podcast? How do you build an audience for a radio show or any sort of other media? That's a real problem, right? Particularly at the point where we're talking about stuff not in terms of sort of a long-term viability, but the idea of going viral. And again, the fact that we're using so much medical pathological language, cancer, metastasizing, viral, this really indicates there's a problem here, I think. Right? Yeah. All these are negative terms.
Negative, yeah, certainly viral and suggesting infection. And the other thing that stands out for me with Governor Cox in particular that is alarming to me, not only, as a broadcaster, as a journalist, but the idea of maybe restricting access. And I know he was referring to controls for children in particular, because frankly, parents aren't doing their job. They're just not doing their job if they don't know what their children are consuming online. But isn't that concerning too, to think that we would start passing laws that would infringe on our First Amendment and restrict our access or ability to have free speech?
Well, and I think that's a big issue that we're actually confronting with, even though we are talking about children. And again, children as children, there's probably a little bit more oversight that's needed in that case. But particularly when we're talking about passing regulation that's government enforced, I think you get into a real issue. If we want to tally this to Nevada, I've actually got a good example. The AB 73 bill on the deepfakes, an election that got passed last legislature. I actually testified on it because the original form of that, no two ways around it. It placed the state in the role of asserting fact and therefore judging political content. That's always very dangerous. But more importantly, their initial thing is that the state would step in if somebody was found to have promoted deepfake videos and issue a fine and whatnot. And that's deeply disturbing because you have a state's interpretation of that content that really can't be regulated. Now, as it came out, how the bill got passed is probably a much better way, where what they've done is created an expedited hearing process where it will fall basically legally under defamation and allow a political opponent that has a deep fake used against them to sue more readily in court within the campaign cycle. And that's acceptable. I think that's a good way. But again, you don't have the state determining what's true and false. You're using an established process.
And you still have the judiciary involved.
Correct.
Yes. And as you just described, too, the way it passed, the focus is narrow now. It is on political advertising in particular. Right.
And, that's going to be one of the things we're gonna be playing with a good bit. I think, is there going to be regulation? Unfortunately, I think we're going to see a lot of proposals. We've had this, the Smith-Mundak has popped back up. This 1948 Act that really initially regulated what the U.S. was broadcasting overseas, but included a prohibition against the government using propaganda against Americans. A lot of people want to see that coming back because they think when that prohibition was repealed in 2012, that's opened the door to a lot of what we've seen with the government stepping in. We can have an argument about that because one of the weird things about Smith-Munn is for decades you couldn't get like the transcripts from Voice of America if you were a U.S. citizen, which is absurd.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because my perspective on this is different than yours because I believe the federal government already controls a certain amount of content and that they are looking at these FCC licenses and they're completely gutting, there's no more balance on the board. And so who gets broadcast licenses? We've seen what's happened with national network television. So I think what's truly chilling, Scott, is the idea that we will have state-run government media.
Well, and unfortunately, we've been moving that way for a good bit of time. Again, FCC licenses, this is, again, another product of 30s and 40s regulatory environment that probably has outlived its usefulness in the current form. And we're going to have to renegotiate. And that's fine. Right. I'm not sure preventing political violence is the best lens through which to approach that regulation.
Oh, no, I don't know how we made that leap. Because honestly, too, the FCC, there is more of an emphasis on the technology and the engineering aspect because there's simply not indefinite airwaves. I mean, the spectrum is only so big. So,
right.
Yes.
Right.
So there has to be some regulation.
Right. There has to be some. And again, of course, the opening of the digital airwaves in the early 2000s have fundamentally changed that. We're not in the environment of the 1930s where this was devised. But still, I think there's a real problem when you start tying these discussions to, and we can also address this content issue. And I think that's one of the things we're going to be seeing more and more and more come out of these debates is effort to put, whether it be deepfakes, whether it be supposedly incendiary language, whether it be uncivil language, right? Those sorts of issues I think are going to increasingly take center stage and in some ways shove some of the technological issues out of the way, right? So this now becomes about something else.
Right, controlling actual content. And just putting in a plug for traditional, old school, legacy broadcasting over the air. This method of broadcasting, this will prevail over any digital, any technology, anything that relies on, the more the spectrum, the digital spectrum that we're talking about. We had this discussion with Elko Amateur Radio Club recently. So in the event of national disaster, your cell phones will not work and you will not be able to stream information and get news. It will be via over-the-air broadcasting and not television, but radio.
Right.
So, yes. So, and then that'll be another great discussion for another day. Right,
yeah.
Scott?
Yeah. Correct.
Yes. Yeah. I want to make sure that we're getting to some of these highlights today because, again, really our goal in sitting down, I was, again, just so appreciative of Scott understanding, dropping what he was doing. There is a certain, urgency to this. We do have a political environment where our leaders have been using, fear to divide Americans. And that does bring in something else where we have a lot of trust in faith. So religious rhetoric, Scott, what can you tell us from maybe a historical and a contemporary perspective about religious rhetoric and how that might be driving this?
Well, I'm not sure religious rhetoric per se is driving this, although it does get used to justify a lot of the positions that are being argued. Of course, the First Amendment prohibits the government from, establishing a religion or preventing the free exercise thereof. I think part of what's going on, though, is we are seeing a situation where there's calls and there's understandings that somehow religion has to be totally separated from any sort of public discourse. And that's problematic in its own right. This idea that the French often use that one should come naked to the public sphere, right? That your personal beliefs need to be left at home and have no role in political process. Well, that's hard to justify in some stances where some of the stuffs we're arguing about, how do we treat, stuff like marriage, that if we see marriage as a civic act, yes, maybe the religious thing doesn't append, but if the government's stepping in and telling religions they have to perform marriages in a certain way, that's problematic. Likewise, some of the debates we've seen both in Texas and some of the stuff that's coming out of the Dearborn area with ideas of Sharia law somehow being integrated into local legal codes. That's also problematic and has a lot of people worried on this as well. But again, both of these issues are sort of religion's just part of a broader policy debate, and just eliminating religion isn't going to do it, because you're going to there's too many people. The United States is unique as a developed country with the number of people who continue to practice religious faith, far more than we see in other developed countries. And just unilaterally eliminating religious discourse is going to alienate people and cause far more problems than figuring out a way to allow it.
Well, and that's also arguable, I think, in a fair sense too, Scott, because we do allow for religious freedom now, but what we are headed for does not. I mean, marriage is a civil contract, so
right,
and same-sex marriage is legal in this country. But if we push back to the right, it will not be legal, and so you will be telling churches you cannot perform those marriages. Do you see what I'm saying? So
yeah. I'm again, from our position, going the other way though, is should the government come in and tell religions they have to perform those ceremonies?
No, absolutely not.
And that's where a lot of this debate, which way that goes back and forth, goes. And again, it's not unique. Do we want to go to something almost like a French system where you have to have, if you want to get married in the church, you have to have 2 ceremonies, because you still have to go in front of the mayor or vice mayor to get married civically, and then, so the state can see it.
So just to the point, just so that we don't lose it, because I know, and we're taking a little extra time over because we got started late today, because we have so many great sponsors, and I appreciate them. I really want to thank them for supporting this effort. So the rhetoric that I was referring to, and again, this is what I see in my social media, so it pops up, and it can be confusing to moderate or even mainstream Americans who maybe aren't familiar with that congregation, that practice. So there is language going around right now urging church members to, quote, rise up, talking about end times, or they're preaching, and this seems to be popular right now, what are you waiting for?
Well, and that's always something that actually is surprisingly frequent in American history. So the rise of sort of the modern fundamentalist movements, for instance, around the First World War, we saw a lot of the same rhetoric. We also saw disastrous pushback on that rhetoric. Is one of the things that eventually leads into why the debate about evolution, the Scopes monkey trial, sort of blows up the way it does. But there's also the issue. It's how representative those voices actually are within the community. There's always groups that have been talking about end times. In times when stuff's going good, it's just a guy on the corner with the sign. When times are bad, all of a sudden they seem to be everywhere, and that's unfortunately part of the paranoia, I think, that goes into societies when they hit stressors, is to see the enemy everywhere.
Well, on that note, too, I think one of the major topics that we could address before we kind of transition toward the end of today's program anyway is just that there may be a time where people actually are threatened, because there's a difference between feeling threatened, right, Scott, and knowing the difference, what the U.S. courts call, a true threat. They're not protected by the First Amendment, and the person making the threats can be arrested. And it can happen on social media, right, where marginal, vulnerable people are literally called out specifically.
Yeah, and certainly no support for that type of stuff. If you're directly threatening somebody, that becomes an action, right, and needs to be dealt with. Some of the stuff we are sort of happy to see, if I could go a bit. We had the candlelight vigil Saturday night for Charlie Kirk. Remarkably peaceful. And I will say that, one of my first calls was to the City of Elko Police Department and discussing with Chief Ward sort of his concerns with it. And I think that's something that has to be, unfortunately, taken into account. I think we also need to pay a lot more attention to people who are consistently making threats regardless of circumstances. And I think that's been part of the pushback we've been seeing here over the last week is some of the celebrations that have come out. It's not just that they're unseemly, but they are in themselves potentially threatening, right? And I think that's something that maybe does require a little bit more looking at by law enforcement communities on, again, on both sides of the coin.
Mm-hmm. Well, and obviously we've been talking about the incident, what led up to all of this. It's not an incident, it was an assassination. A conservative activist, Turning Point USA co-founder Charlie Kirk, shot and killed last Wednesday. He was publicly debating. He was in an event hosted by Utah Valley University. The suspect is apprehended. That's not the topic of our discussion today. There's plenty of that going on. But I'm wondering, Scott, do you know the name of the Minnesota lawmaker? Do you know her name?
Melissa Hortman.
Okay, good. You passed the test.
Okay.
Because some, have you noticed that?
Oh, yeah.
Why was that not the same?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons, none of which are necessarily nefarious. I think part of it is the fact that, one, whatever Ms. Hartman did locally there in Minnesota, she wasn't of the same national stature I think Charlie Kirk was. And like it or not, that plays a lot into how public reacts to stuff, how well known somebody is. I think part of the problem that's going on is that seems to be a much more muddled case politically, just in the sense that, yeah, the guy probably was right wing, but he had some other leanings, and there's some evidence that this was not at something aimed to potentially stop a movement per se, right? And I think that is how a lot of people were reading this. This was really aimed to stop an activity, as opposed to just a grievance born against stuff. Now, we can argue, and part of the problem with this is because the Minnesota case was caught as a local matter. We have not seen as full of an investigation into the background of the shooter in that case, right? And in fact, a lot of people tend not to use the term assassination, even though there was another lawmaker shot at the same time.
Oh, and she and her husband and their dog, they were all assassinated. It was definitely a political assassination.
And, but that has not been the terminology that's been as frequently applied to that case for whatever reason.
Again, it comes back to the top. And we know we are talking to the chairman of the Elko County Democratic Republican Party. And Scott, that's a newly inherited position for you, one that I know that you would rather not be filling because we all loved and admired Lee Hoffman so much.
Yeah, he did a lot of good work in this community over the years.
Absolutely. So we're going to plug a couple of things too before we sign off because we do appreciate Scott's time. But what I would like us to go away with, I guess, in this program, and then maybe a foundation for future discussions about this particular issue is that, and these are not my words, I'm taking these words from the late Melissa Hortman's Facebook page, is that we are called to be Americans first.
Mm-hmm. Agree 100%.
Not Republicans, not Democrats. We're standing together against the violence that we are experiencing, to unite around what makes us one people, one nation under God, what unites us, our love for freedom, our belief in justice, and our hope for a better future, that it's far greater and far stronger than what divides us. And what is remarkable, really, as didn't have enough time to really talk about, and what we should never forget is that both Melissa Hortman and Charlie Kirk were deeply loved by the American people. We are in different political times, but it comes from the top. Scott, we need leadership that unites us and does not perpetuate this.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that's something that until Washington as a whole gets its act together, we're not gonna have a lot of forward motion.
Well, here at home, there are things that we can do together to enhance our ability to appreciate. And we used to be able to have these amazing civil discussions. I mean, I think that on a certain level, we still do, Scott, obviously. Mm-hmm. But on social media, no, it's not happening, So there is a panel discussion on Thursday. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah. So again, mentioning Lance, I reached out to Lance and Janine Hansen with the Independent American Party. Of course, this is Constitution Week, right? 238th anniversary of the Constitutional Convention approving the Constitution and sending it to the states for ratification. So this Thursday, September 18th, at the Elko Performing Arts Building, the Elko County Democrats, the Elko County Republicans, and the Independent American Party, we're going to have a panel discussion. We've actually asked, it's going to be moderated by our Board of Trustees President Matt McCarty, and we've asked the area high schools, their American history and American government classes, to submit questions. None of us are seeing the questions ahead of time. Right, so Matt's going to go through, choose the questions, hopefully one from each school. So if any of the school people are listening, get those questions into Matt by tomorrow. And we're just going to have a discussion and talk about some of these differences. And like we've shown a lot of times, particularly being out here in rural Nevada, we tend to be far more alike than we are different, right? And letting some of this stuff come out.
That panel discussion, entitled We the People, Celebrating the Constitution, again Thursday, September 18th, 6 to 7:30 p.m., Elko Performing Arts Center there on the Elko High School campus. You can also listen to it live. It's going to be broadcast on Global One Media's talk radio station 107.7 FM. So that's great access there as well. But being there in person is always fun when there's a live broadcast, Scott. So
Yeah, please come on out, and we're going to have a little reception afterwards with some birthday cake for the Constitution, so you're welcome to join us for that.
Nice. Dr. Scott Gavorsky has been our guest today as we're talking about this discussion. Hopefully we'll have many more, but you can catch Scott Gavorsky alongside his co-host Crystal Newton. They have a new discussion each week of key issues, interviews with special guests, and a look at rural Nevadans' roles in today's events. It's a podcast, so you go to 775alive.com, and it's streaming on most major platforms, right?
Yes, we're quite happy with how it's going, so give us a listen.
All right. Congratulations, Scott, on the podcast, and thank you, and good luck on Thursday. And thank you for the conversation today. I really appreciate your perspective.
Thank you for having us in.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Elko Live. You can find this program archived at elkoradio.com.